Hey everybody! In this video I'm going to show you how to create kind of a cool optical illusion while also learning how to control your pencil and create some smooth shading. So I've got just a standard eraser, a blending stump, a regular pencil. This could be just like your standard run-of-the-mill pencil, and I have an ebony pencil, which is a little bit darker. So what I'm going to do is I am going to just create some organic shapes. So they're curved and not super geometric, right? Just organic shapes, and they're going to kind of interact with one another on the page, kind of working around each other. Think of it like we're going to be creating almost some organic looking tubes, or I don't know, like we're looking into some sort of alien interior. That's kind of what this is going to look like when we're all done. So I'm kind of working on creating this sort of space in between the shapes that is relatively thin, and kind of interacts with the other shapes that I'm creating. And it's okay if I don't like everything I'm doing, I can always change it. All right, so once I've filled up my page with these different shapes, then I am going to create a second layer of them that's going to be sitting inside the big shapes and kind of underneath it. So I'm going to do the exact same thing, but they're going to be sitting behind this. So the space in between the shapes I just drew is going to become our positive space. If I want, I could really lightly draw over that line, and then I can erase it later so that I end up with a more connected piece. And then, yeah, once I've connected my shape, I can just erase out what I had before. And I'm just going to continue creating those shapes throughout my second layer. Okay, so now I have 2 layers drawn. From here, I'm going to start shading. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lightly shade the second layer, and then wherever the sort of positive space sits underneath the first layer, I'm going to make it just a little bit darker. Now here's where we start to talk about shading. So when we talk about shading, we talk about pressure. Pressure is really important here. So I want this first layer to be very light in value. So that means I don't want to push really hard with my pencil. I want to be very gentle with it. So I'm going to hold my pencil kind of sideways here. I call this a sketch grip. So when I hold my pencil like this, it allows me to be really loose with it. And so I'm barely holding it. I'm very lightly gripping it. So that way I can also kind of like put it in the palm of my hand just a little bit too. This way I can lighten the pressure of my pencil as I go along. So when I am shading, I'm using the side of my pencil and I am barely touching the paper right now. I'm very, very gently filling in this space. So when you are shading lightly, you want to have a very delicate touch. I'm just working on making sure my marks are close together so that I have a nice even layer of value. And I want to be kind of consistent in pressure as I'm moving across. All right, so from here, I've got kind of a nice layer of value, and I'm just going to continue shading throughout the rest of the page. So as I make my way around, I want to try and work, for me, since I'm left-handed, I'm going to work right to left so that I'm less likely to smudge this as I'm working. So we finished our second layer, but our first layer shading. Some things we want to look for is, um, are we creating a nice transition from dark to light, from the shadows to the lighter areas? One way to tell if your values have a smooth transition from dark to light would be to take a step back from it. So maybe hold your artwork up, and step maybe like 5 or 6 feet away from it. And if you feel like it's kind of chunky still, like it just goes like dark, light, then, you might need to work on your transitions just a little bit more and create some values that are kind of in the middle. Um, so what we're going to do is just continue creating layers. And so what we're going to do is just continue creating layers, kind of going down further and further into this piece. And as we create each layer, it's going to get darker and darker with the shading. So I'm going to draw some more shapes throughout here. We want to be very thoughtful of how our shapes kind of interact with one another. So we don't want to be like really heavy with open spaces on one side and then light on spaces on the other side. So it's important to kind of think about the big picture as you are creating your shapes. All right, now we have our third layer, so we are going to start shading a little bit darker. Now, if you're like me, being left-handed, I mean, this is going to happen to everybody when we're shading, but when you write, you tend to smudge, right? If you're a smudger like me, which I think everybody will be in this exercise, you will want a scrap piece of paper. I'm going to fold it down just to make it a little smaller. But what we're going to do is just rest this paper under our hand as we're drawing, and that way our hand is going to rub across the scrap paper instead of our artwork, which is going to make it much less likely to smudge. So from here, we are going to work on our third layer, and this is going to be darker than the last layer we just did. So we want to be kind of a step darker in our shading. I'm still using my regular pencil at this point. When we're shading, you can be incredibly versatile with just one pencil. You don't need to have like a full set of fancy drawing pencils to shade with. Really, what's going to make it work for you is being able to control the pencil that you have. So if you can't control it, it doesn't matter if you have a fancy set of, like 12 different uh, softnesses or hardnesses of pencils, like that's not going to matter if you can't control them. So it's actually really, really helpful to learn how to do this with just one pencil first. So you're just going to work on being able to control the pressure and the consistency of the marks as you're working on them. So in this case, like I'm working on gently lessening the pressure as I get further away from the shaded areas, or like the areas in shadow where they overlap, until I'm not pressing down on the page as much. So on the last one, my lightest value was barely touching the paper. Like it was the barest feather of a touch. Um, Whereas this one has a little more pressure to it. So I'm just going to continue shading with this, but I'm also considering, like, am I slightly darker than the last layer? So I think my darker value in the first layer is kind of my middle value, or my lighter value in this third layer. So as I'm shading, I'm really thinking about keeping my marks close together, and that is going to help create kind of a more even, smooth area of value as I'm going about. If I'm scribbling and working too quickly, it's going to look kind of sloppy, really. Um, so I'm really mindful of how close together my marks are. I'm actually kind of moving in a slightly circular motion as I'm doing this, and that helps me overlap just a little bit so I don't have as many gaps in the values as I go around. Now that we have a few layers done, hopefully you kind of get the gist of the repetition that we're going to do. We're just going to keep making layers, and then eventually we'll just have like a few areas of negative space that we're going to fill in with a darker shadow. I found that as I was shading in my second layer, I was starting to have to press pretty hard with my pencil to get those darker shadows as I was going. So what that tells me is it's probably a good time that when I start shading again, I can switch to my ebony pencil. So the ebony pencil is going to be a softer graphite, and it will allow you to shade a little bit darker. It's pretty versatile too, so you could create a lot of different marks with it. You could just also go with a higher number of B pencils. So I could do a 2B, 4B, 6B, 8B. Any of those would be softer graphite than just a plain old B. So that would also give you darker marks. So I'm just going to speed things up real fast to finish everything up, but just know that with each layer, I'm going to start pressing a little bit harder and harder and harder as I'm shading to create darker values. So let's finish things up. At this point, I could keep adding more layers, but what I think I'm going to do is actually just kind of start to fill in the background. So I'm going to make it really dark. And as a final thought, if you wanted to make your marks really smooth and soft, you could use a blending stump to kind of push the graphite around. Now, what I would suggest for that is to start at the top layer first and then slowly make your way down the layers. Because if you start with the darkest area first, you're going to build up a lot of graphite on the blending stump. And then it's going to put that darker stuff on areas where you may not want it. If you do build up too much graphite onto your blending stump, obviously if you have another side, you could use it, or you could take a little piece of sandpaper and just scrape that extra graphite right off of it, and then it'll be good as new. So we're going to finish up here, speed things up. So I've gone in with a kneaded eraser and my regular eraser and just kind of cleaned up edges and given a little more highlights throughout after smoothing things with my blending stump. And you don't have to use the blending stump, you don't have to use the eraser. If you control your pencil really well, you should have really nice, clean, even marks to begin with. But the blending stump's just kind of an extra tool to help you out as you work along. So I hope you try it yourself. Thanks for watching and keep creating.